Sunday night service of First Baptist Church in Lucedale, Mississippi. Has your life ever been opposed by the power of a storm? You sensed God was leading you in a particular direction, and then all of a sudden the bottom fell out, the storm came, your ship began to sink. Maybe it's sinking now. There are moments in life that make us feel like all of life is just random and out of control. Yet David said in Psalm 139, "And in your book they were all written, the days that were ordained for me before there was as yet one of them." If my days are all written, recorded in God's book, if God has a purpose for my life, if He guides my life and guards my life, then does what seems to be random, even chaotic, fall under the providence of God? I hope to answer that question from this story in the life of Paul. It's a story that we've looked at before, Acts chapter 27, but I'd like to put a little different twist on it tonight as we look at it. You see, sometimes we think Bible characters live lives completely different than our own, yet their lives are much like ours, and that's why the Bible is relevant. So would you say, based on what you know about Paul's life, that God had a purpose for Paul's life? Why, of course He did. That's very clear in Scripture. Even when God sent Ananias to Paul's house, to where he was, to talk with him after Paul saw the bright light from heaven, God said about Paul, He said, "He is a chosen instrument of mine." He said He's going to appear before kings and Gentiles, and I'm going to show him how much he must suffer for my sake. So God's purpose for Paul's life was detailed right down to the suffering he would endure as a result of participating in God's purpose. God had a destination, a purpose for Paul's life. He does for yours, and He does for mine. Even when chance and circumstance threatened to throw Paul's life off course, God was still the captain of Paul's ship, the captain of his destiny. So in Acts chapter 27, we're going to look at this chaotic journey that Paul took. It's a trip on the sea via ship. The circumstances were out of Paul's control, yet this chaotic period of Paul's life, it becomes very clear, is governed by the prevailing purpose of God. Now, I want you to take a step back and view your life from God's perspective and ask yourself, is there a hand at work behind the scenes in my life? Does the journey of my life bear the design of a master artist? Well, Paul's journey seemed reckless and full of disaster. Just reading it, it seems that way. It seemed as if the journey was doomed, as if it was never meant to be. But let me remind you again that back of Paul's journey was the prevailing purpose of God. Paul was in a storm, but in the midst of that storm, God reminded him that He had a greater plan for his life that was being brought to fruition in spite of that storm. In Acts chapter 27, that purpose is clearly stated in verse 24. It is the purpose of God for Paul's life. And God told Paul, "You must stand before Caesar." Paul would make it to Rome in spite of the chaotic journey, in spite of the storm. And Paul would give witness to Caesar and his household. Now, what if it is God's purpose to do something similar with one of you? Perhaps it's the prevailing purpose of God to bring you face to face with some government leader or leader of state and give you an audience with them that you might share your personal faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. If you do, it'll be critical in that moment that you share with them how God has guided and governed your life to bring you to that moment. But what happens when the purpose of God for your life meets outside resistance? That's really the story in Acts chapter 27. It became apparent that the purpose for Paul's life was being opposed by the power of a storm. Is such a thing happening in your life? Has God called you and a storm opposed you? I'll not name that storm. You already know its name and know the purpose of God that it's hindering in your life. So with those thoughts in mind, we'll just turn to Acts chapter 27, and I'll begin by reading verses 1 through 4. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some of the other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So the wind was against Paul. That's just simply, it was against the ship. It was against everybody on board the ship. But the wind also appeared to be against the purpose that God had for Paul's life. So number one, consider the wind that opposed. There was nothing that was an omen of impending doom or disaster as they began that trip. It was just apparent that at that moment, at least, the wind was not favorable for the voyage. It was going to be an uphill sail on the sea as they were going against the wind. Make no mistake, the wind has often become a tool of the enemy to assault the faith of the people of God. This may have been an ordinary wind and just that and nothing more. However, as you read the story, it seems as if the wind had a mind of its own. It had an intent. If you read in the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 19, about the great wind from the wilderness that swept down upon the house where Job's children were and killed them all, you will see that this was not a wind sent from God. It came in opposition to the prevailing purpose of God in the life of God's servant Job. On another occasion, you might remember the time that Jesus sent his disciples across the Sea of Galilee, but the wind opposed them. Matthew says in his gospel, the wind was contrary. Later, Jesus would rebuke that wind, and the word used to rebuke the wind is the same word, and it was done in the same fashion as when he rebuked demons. Some wondered if the storm itself on that occasion was not conjured by the one who opposed the prevailing purpose of God in the life of the disciples. So I simply ask you, has the work of God in your life met resistance? Is there a wind, a current, an activity that seems to oppose, to stand against the fulfillment of God's purpose in your life? So let's go back to Paul's story. They pressed on in their journey. God was guiding and governing Paul's journey, but the wind, or the entity that drove the wind, continued its resistance. If you read the next verses, you see how subtly but surely this wind sought to keep Paul from the purpose that God had in his life. Verses 5 through 7. When we sailed across the open sea off the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we landed in Myra at Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. So first, the wind opposed. Second, you will see this wind did not permit. The wind seemed not to want the fulfillment of God's purpose in the life of Paul. We have talked before about the life of the disciples as they faced a storm on the Sea of Galilee. And you'll remember another one of those times when Peter stepped out of the boat with great faith and began to walk toward Jesus. But then Peter saw something in that storm that terrified him. He saw the strength of the wind that had opposed them as they began to cross the sea, now opposed him. as he made his way toward Jesus. Have you encountered such a wind? You feel called to move toward Jesus, but every time you do, every time you try to make a step in God's direction, there's some resistance. Maybe the resistance doesn't always come from the same place or the same person or the same source, but there is resistance nonetheless. There is something that doesn't want you moving toward Jesus. There is something that opposes the purpose of God in your life. Watch how this unfolds in Paul's life. First, it was a wind that simply opposed. Then it became a wind that did not permit. Remember, Paul is a prisoner of his circumstances. Not only so, he now finds himself and the people who are with him at the mercy of the wind. If Paul had been allowed to follow his own wits and wisdom, he would have called off this journey. It would have been postponed. This seemed to him not the time to move in the direction that God intended him to go. So as Paul looked ahead, all he could see was disaster in his future. Maybe that's all you can see. Maybe you have this terribly anxious feeling as you realize your life and your circumstances are spinning out of control, and you simply want to stop the journey. You wish you could just stop the world from spinning, and tomorrow wouldn't come with the disaster that you now see on the horizon, but your ship just keeps on sailing. Well, that's the way it was for Paul. He moved along the coast with difficulty. The Bible says in verse 8, they came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lycia. Much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous. By now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to Paul, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. So from Paul's perspective, circumstances were dismal, but that was Paul's perspective. You also have a perspective about your circumstances. You might even have a perspective about the direction that your life is going at the present time. Henry Blackaby, in the study Experiencing God, said, you never know the truth about your circumstances until you've heard from the truth. Who is the truth? The truth is Jesus. And at this point, Paul had not heard from the truth. All he knew is that they seemed to be headed toward disaster. And that may be how it feels in your life right now. The seas of your life may be shrouded in a fog of uncertainty. But let me remind you, what Paul couldn't see and what you can't see is the prevailing purpose of God that lies above it all. Whatever it seems like now, keep your trust in God, because He has a direction and a destination for your life, just like He did for Paul. Verses 12 and 13. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. There was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. So first, there was the wind that opposed. Second, there was the wind that did not permit. And then there was this gentle south wind. That was a deceptive wind. Deceptive winds are those that allow us to move forward with the intention of sinking us later. There are opportunities that open to us like great jaws inviting us in, only to clamp themselves around us once we've arrived. The deceptive wind is the wind that presents itself as an open door from God, only later to find out it's not. The deceptive wind is one that can easily destroy our faith and our hope of ever fulfilling God's purpose. But I want you to know something. The prevailing purpose of God simply can't be frustrated in your life or in mine. Once I made a major decision about God's leadership. After I made it, I had second thoughts. I thought, oh my goodness, I've made a mess of my life. I've made a terrible mistake. If I miss this, then I have messed my whole life up and God's whole plan for my life up. Then God led me to a verse from the book of Job, Job chapter 42, verse 2, and this is what it says. Now I know that thou canst do all things, and that no purpose of thine can be thwarted. Job said that even before everything had worked out in his life, understanding that God was sovereign, that God had a prevailing purpose about his life, in spite of all the calamity that surrounded him. God's purpose always prevails. It did in Job's life. It did in Paul's life. It will in your life. So trust him. God's purpose was that Paul stand before Caesar, and that's what would happen. That's the purpose that God would accomplish. Paul would get to where he needed to be because God was guiding and governing his life. Well, if you look at verse 14, you see before long there was a wind of hurricane force. Number 4, there was this violent wind. As you can see in the story, if you continue to read, things went from bad to worse in the situation. The ship began to break up on the sea. And perhaps you know that story in your own life. Maybe things have gone from bad to worse in your circumstances, only it's not a shipwreck. Maybe it's a wrecked marriage or a wrecked life or something in your life that has become a sinking ship. Maybe it's the ship of your own hope. Your very soul is sinking in the storm of despair. Like Paul, there will be times in your life when the storms of life will be stronger than you. There will be times when the problems you face will be bigger than you and more than you can handle. There will be times when, in spite of all your efforts to salvage the situation, your ship still appears to be sinking. The violent wind that blows through your life seems designed to destroy your faith and your family. In that kind of crisis, there will be times when you want to give up. Do you know why Paul didn't give up? Paul didn't give up because Paul was aware that the crisis itself was controlled by God. God had a prevailing purpose for Paul's life, and he would see to its fulfillment in spite of those circumstances. Listen, God knows where you are, and he doesn't need a GPS to find you. The clouds of your circumstances can't hide you from his eyes. The prevailing purpose of God for your life cannot be thwarted by the power of a storm. Whatever crisis that you find yourself in, that crisis is controlled by God. Finally, I want you to see that Paul's life, like yours and mine, was guided by the prevailing purpose of God. Let me begin reading in verse 21 of Acts chapter 27. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete, then you would not have had this loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Because last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I believe it will turn out exactly as I have been told. Is the purpose of God for your life being opposed by the power of a storm? Do you sense that the winds are against you, that you're not being permitted to move forward? Have you made some mistakes in your journey of life, yielding to some deceptive wind that you thought was an open door that turned out to be a disaster? Does it seem to you that the circumstances of your life threaten to sink you and your family? Then don't abandon ship. The purpose of God will not be thwarted by the power of the storm. Keep trusting him. You may not see right now what God is doing or how he is working. You may see no hope on the horizon, but keep your trust in God. God is the one who kept Paul's head above water until he brought him safely through. The same God, whose purpose prevailed in Paul's life, will also prevail in yours and mine. I hope you will keep your eyes on Him in spite of the storm, in spite of the winds that blow in and around your life. Thank you so much for listening.